So let me start by with actually these set of quotes. So Paul Samuelson, 1958, the economics textbook, which I don't know, many of you probably don't read it and haven't probably seen it, but certainly until about, 2 decades ago, it was the book. Economics is about the world of prices, wages, interest rates, stocks and bonds, banks and credit, taxes and expenditure. And you have an update, the Greg Mankiw book, 2004. There is no mystery about what an economy is. An economy is just a group of people interacting with one another as they go about their lives. And some people think this is a major change. And indeed, if you go back, there is a book that some of you probably have heard of. It's certainly very much in the news, The Moral Limits of Markets. And in fact, the claim in this book is that economics was designed for what Samuelson thought economics was all about, but economics has spilled over and now thinks it has things to say about everything under the sun. And I just want to draw attention, we are all in Cambridge here, and I think it's worth mentioning the principles from Marshall in 1890. It's not very different from Greg Mankiw. Economics is the study of people in the ordinary business of life. So I think all that goes around comes around. So, okay, so let me now go back to the, I think one of the important statements at the intersection of sociology and economics. This is the 1985 Mark Granovetter paper, Economic Action and Social Structure, the Problem of Embeddedness. It's very interesting that he wrote this. This is just about the time when social economics as we know it, this is a bit of history of economic thought, but really this is a time when game theory, repeated games, and a lot of game theory and applied game theory was emerging. General equilibrium was, Larry should probably say more on this. This is the time when general equilibrium was probably very mature.
Dying.
Okay. And so this is a very important and actually a wonderful piece, which I would urge all of you to dip into. It's a wonderful piece of work, and like all great pieces of work, it actually allows everyone reads into it what they feel like reading into the book and into this paper. So now, 30 years later, in fact, we have the reverse, Michael Sandel critique. And what I want to do is to draw both of them in and talk a little bit about, on the one hand, in the last 30 years, we've come a long way from the concerns that Mark Granovetter had, that we were having an unsocial or unsocialized or under-socialized notion of economic activity. In fact, people like Michael Sandel would say that we have gone into things, into society where we have no business being doing things and using an economic approach. What I want to do is to move on and talk more concretely about phenomena. And you can take your favorite phenomenon from this list. And in fact, in these lectures this week, there will be some of them actually will be discussed at some length. And I wanted to talk a bit about contagion. So many of us here in this room are interested in contagion problems. You could be interested in contagion in a political context. You could be thinking about the Arab Spring. You could be thinking about financial contagion, as in banks or countries going under. You could be thinking of social change, ideas taking over communities where there were none. So there's a lot of interest in tipping point kind of ideas. Now, it's hard to see how one makes sense of that sort of a phenomenon using an anonymous random matching sort of framework. And so it's the natural model, the natural way to think about contagion or resilience, whether you think about financial contagion, is a setting where there are a number of actors or a number of banks, and they are sort of connected in complicated ways, which we know they are. You have the data, you see that. And in fact, the connections between them matter for how shocks spread. Or if there's a shock in the system in one part of the system, how it spreads through the system relates in a fundamental way to the connections in the system. And so it's quite natural that we want to move on to look at models which have those building blocks. So there's a large number of entities. Each of the people in this population interact with a very small subset, and these subsets overlap. So that's really what I'm saying is you have a large population, but there's local interaction. And so you need a framework which allows you to model these structures, and it allows you to measure them. And that's what the idea behind networks is. And so it's a very natural way of thinking about many of these phenomena. And so it's not surprising that over the last 20 years or so, there has been a tremendous explosion and interest in studying phenomena or problems using networks. Okay. And of course, networks go back a long way, and certainly they go back a long way in mathematics. And a lot of the excitement has been to bring some of that mathematics into problems that were earlier being studied using different, very different models or different concepts. And so what I want to do today, and this is at a high level, but what I want to do today is to take a few lines from Granovetter's book. From his paper, he argued for a middle path between the extremes of social determinism and the anonymous individual. And what I want to claim is, and I have only about 4 hours to, to persuade you, that we have done actually a lot of work in the last 20 years, and we made a lot of significant progress in understanding how structure and agency, human agency, jointly shape behavior and collective outcomes. So this is, as I said, at a high level, and what I'll be doing in my lectures is to give you a sense of some of the concepts. How do you think about questions, concrete problems, empirical phenomena, using network models? And I'll do that by actually writing down models and showing you how you introduce networks in these different models. And I'll cover some well-known papers, but then I'll also talk about new work that I'm doing and others are doing to give you a sense of where the frontier is. And I'll spend a few minutes also in the slides. You'll see that there are actually a lot of slides, and there's no way that I'll cover all those slides in the time allotted to me. So in fact, most of the slides will be for your own perusal. Whenever you have the time, you can read those slides. And a fair bit of the slides, in fact, towards the end, is about new and open problems. Okay, so that's going to be the plan. Here's the structure. So I'm more or less through with the introduction. Lecture 2 is, so very broadly speaking, and it's a simple way of thinking, really, and I'm going to follow that. I'm going to first talk about a situation where the structure, which will be modeled as a network, is given, and there is activity going on in the network. And I want to ask how this social structure shapes behavior. Okay, so, and that's going to be the subject of the rest of the 1 hour. And later today, what I'll be doing there is really I'm going to be talking about games played on fixed networks. And I'll talk a little bit about some important early papers, and but then I'll move very quickly in lecture 3 to some new work that I'm doing on the network origins of market power. How it's interesting to think about supply chains or transport networks in terms of networks, and then think about market power and regulation and mergers and so on in those contexts, using a networks perspective. So that's going to be the second lecture later today. And tomorrow I'm going to move to the other side of the literature, which is mostly concerned about network formation. How do networks arise? How do you think about, how do you, as an economist, how do you write down models of network formation? And so what I'll be doing is combining the games on networks papers today with some work on network formation. And that's what I'll be doing tomorrow morning. Okay, so that's the layout. Okay. So maybe I'll pause if there are any comments or questions at this point.
Maybe to add to your introduction, there is a famous quote by Ehud Kalai saying that once game theory was not even a field in economics, now economics is a field of game theory.
Okay.
I think it's,
So he's the editor of the games journal. So of course, he would like to.
And the founder of the
Yes. Okay. So one of the arguments I'm going to make, and I won't have time actually to make it, I'm sure, is that I think we need to go beyond game theory when we want to do serious networks work. And in fact, that's a major conceptual challenge, how to do interesting work in networks, which I think will involve. And so there's a sense in which, that's, I think, a major conceptual challenge. And I'd like to just put it there for you to mull over, but I probably won't have time to.
Do you mean that as a beyond game theory as a model of interactive rationality?
So I just want to put it there. Okay, we're going to talk about it. Okay.
You and Ariel Rubinstein are on the same page here,
Yeah, well, you should tell Ariel this. Yes. Good. We've been sitting and having coffee in the same cafe, so we are friends.
Actually, with Ariel, that's a pretty common. Yeah.
Okay, good. So we are sort of on the start of the more formal bit. Now, again, I'm going to run these lectures in a very, in a slightly idiosyncratic way. I'm going to, on the one hand, the slides are fairly detailed. They don't probably have all the details of the proofs, but I think there's enough out there that you can sketch the proofs. On the other hand, because of the heterogeneity in the audience here, both in terms of interests and background, I'm going to try and keep the lectures at a reasonably general level. So depending on your interests and your inclination, you can dip in more or less into the details. Okay, so they are there, and you can dip into them when you like, but I'll skim over many of the details as I go along. Okay, it's deliberate. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to ask, how does social structure affect behavior? And I'm going to think of social structure as essentially as a graph. And so there's going to be people who are sitting in some social structure. That social structure is a graph. And just to fix ideas, let's just actually draw a picture. Okay, so this would be a very simple. This is a simple social structure I've drawn out. What this is doing, this is simply specifying there's a set of people here. These are the nodes, and I'm going to number them. So this is a group of 10 people, and they are connected. This connection could be of different kinds. It could be simply friendships. It could be co-authorships. It could be it could be that they're working jointly on a project in a classroom. There could be any number of reasons why there is a link between 1 and 3, for instance. But this is what I mean when I say a social structure for the purposes of this lecture. It's just a graph. And I'm going to be talking more about specific applications and the detailed different ways of thinking about this. But really what I'm mostly going to be interested in is asking how how is the behavior of Mr. Six, for instance, affected by the fact that she has all these connections and she is situated in a particular place in a network as compared to Mr. One. Okay, that's the kind of question I want to ask. Okay, so how is it that maybe their choices are different? Maybe they adopt, actions or ideas at a different pace. If they are doctors, maybe they prescribe medicines at a different time. If they are farmers, maybe they adopt crops or pesticides at a different moment. Okay, so there are a number of different applications you can think of, and but the broad question here is how does the structure, which is these links and these people, affect the behavior of all these people who are, it could be at a point in time, it could be over time, depending on the question that you want to study. And this is a very rich literature. There's a lot of work, and it goes back a long way. There's a lot of empirical work, which goes back at least to the 50s. There's famous work on the spread of tetracycline, for instance, by James Coleman and his co-authors. There's work on spread of crops and hybrid seeds. There's a very large literature in economics and agriculture, especially on how crops or best agricultural practices spread in social networks. What I'll be doing is looking at a very, very simple model. And before I get into the specifics of the model, let me just summarize the questions we'll be looking at. So we have the social network. That's one building block. And the second key building block to this whole thing is, depending on the application you're looking at, it could be diffusion of information, ideas, products, etc. There's some dynamics to it. There's some learning activity going on. Or it could be just a static problem where you're gathering information and you're sharing it with your neighbors. And there's a public good element to that. And I'll be talking specifically about that model in the lecture today. So as I said, these are the questions. How does the structure and location affect behavior? As you change the network, how is behavior altered? And we are very interested in the question, are some social structures better for welfare or equality than other social structures? Okay. So I should say that each of these questions in different ways echo major concerns in sociology if you go back 40, 50 years. In fact, sociologists would be very comfortable with these sort of questions. How does social structure matter? Okay, so there are many modeling issues once you have formulated that framework and once you have started thinking about the problem. There are just a number of different ways in which you can set up the model. And I won't I'm not going to take the time to actually go through that today. What I have already talked a little bit about the framework, and I think for simplicity you should fix your mind on that being the network, and each of these people is making a choice. It's a set of actions they have, and they choose amongst the set of actions. There's a little more notation here. Each person I chooses from a set of actions, strategies S, and I think there's a typo there, but basically this is a compact subset, or you would the set of actions that you like, you can fix that. It could be a binary choice, 0, 1, and so the payoffs to a person I will depend on the actions of everyone and the graph G, okay, the network G. Okay. So as I said, there is a graph which is fixed for the moment. There is the strategic, the externalities, or the nature of the interaction, and that shows up in the payoff function pi I. So how do you model the way G and the S interact to generate the payoff? And a lot of the literature so far has tended to look at a very simple model. We think about the payoff. We think about the network here, and supposing we are interested in one's payoff, all that matters for one is what one does and what his neighbors do. What's a neighbor? A neighbor of one is simply a person who has a direct link with one. So in this case, it will be the actions of one and the actions of 3. Okay, but if you're looking at Mr. 5, then it will be his actions and the actions of 3, 4, and 6, and so on. Okay, so what we have here is a model where you care about your actions and the actions of your immediate neighbors. And all the other people, other than your neighbors, you treat the non-neighbors as though they were all, in the same pool. Okay. So if you take that view of how you define payoffs, then you can write down the payoffs. Just trying to find. Oops. How does it? Is there a pointer?
Yes, sorry, in the middle, if you push it, it will be a laser.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. So these are the pure local effects model. What's happening here is that your payoff for person I depends on the graph G and the strategy profile S, and it depends on the actions of the neighbors, which is a set n sub I of G, and the action of player I. Okay, so there's some technical notation here, which is simply saying you care only about the profile of actions of your neighbors. You don't care about who is doing which action. So it's anonymous. The other extreme case would be pure global effects, where you only care about the actions of everyone. You don't care about the network at all. So the network drops out. Okay. So of course you can have combinations of these models, and this slide gives you a flavor of the varieties that can be accommodated within this very simple model. So here what we have in equation 1 is a very simple model where you care about your actions, the actions of the neighbors, and the actions of all the non-neighbors. A specific functional form of that, specific functional form for F and H would be this sum payoffs. And I imagine that at some point Larry might come back to some special cases of this model where you care about the sum or the average of your neighbors and non-neighbors, in social interactions models. Okay.
I promise.
Yes. So, okay, so we are almost at the end of the general bit. Okay, so in terms of general sort of concepts, so here's a key slide. And this slide gives you a sense of how actions that I take might affect my neighbors. And the first definition is about whether my action is sort of a good for my neighbor or a bad for my neighbors. So you have a positive externality if an increase in the actions of the neighbors increases the payoff of the person I. And it's a negative externality otherwise. And the second definition is a key when you're thinking about the strategic structure of the problem. And really what this definition is saying is when my neighbors increase their actions, when they increase their actions, what does it do to the incentives I have for raising or lowering my actions? And this is captured very nicely in the notion of complements and substitutes. And the idea is that if my neighbor's actions go up, then my returns from increasing my action, going from SI prime to SI, go up if the actions of neighbors and myself are strategic complements. And this inequality is reversed if the actions, my action and my neighbor's actions, are substitutes. Okay. So this will become a little more clear once I go through some examples. So this slide comes from a paper by Rachel and Jan Bramole, and this is a very simple model where everyone is choosing a single action. This is SI, and the payoffs are given by equation 3. They are f of some function, which is the sum of i's action and the sum of the neighbor's actions, less the cost of acquiring or cost of the action SI, which is a linear function in this case. Okay, so f is concave, which implies directly that when my neighbors increase their actions, the marginal returns to my increasing my action fall. In other words, this is a game of pure local effects because I only care about my neighbor's actions, and it is a game of positive externalities because when they increase their actions, my f is a increasing function, my payoff goes up, but the marginal returns to SI go down in the sum of my neighbor's actions. Okay, so it's a game of strategic substitutes. Okay, here's another well-known formulation. This captures the idea of strategic complements. This is taken from a paper by Ballister, Calvo, and Zenu. And the idea here is, again, you have this payoff for player I, and he's sitting in some network, depends on his action. There is rho is negative to make this problem well behaved, and the key bit is the last term here, and you see that gamma is positive. So if you have neighbors, if I and j are neighbors and j increases his action, then the marginal returns to I from increasing his action goes up. So this is a game of strategic complements. Okay, and so one can write down much more general variants of these payoffs. The key idea to take away from these slides is, on the one hand, you have positive externalities that corresponds to the definition 1, and on the other hand, you have complements versus substitutes, and that has a big impact on the strategic structure of the problem and also on the nature of equilibria that we'll be studying. Okay. So I now want to talk about a game which is a little, in some ways it's even simpler, but it brings out the richness of this framework. What I'm doing here is I'm going to bring out, put up an example of a game where naturally actions are complements and substitutes depending on the network. Okay, so it's not the case that you're only interested in substitutes or complements, but you would be interested in both. Okay, so this is a setting where there are firms which are competing in a market, and they have a cost to producing, and their costs are going down in their R&D expenditure. This is the per unit cost of production, and it's going down in how much I does invest in R&D and how much his neighbors invest in R&D. Okay, so with a little bit of simple algebra, you get this payoff function, which is what happens in equilibrium in the game that the firms play once they have done this R&D. And what you see, if you stare at this for a few minutes, you can figure this out. Notice there's a quadratic payoff here. What you see here is that the payoffs are, the actions of neighbors are positive externality. They create a positive externality. The actions of non-neighbors create a negative externality. Out here, there's this negative term. The actions of neighbors are complements. That's this bit here. And the actions of non-neighbors are substitutes. There's this negative term, which is quadratic. So what you have here is a very simple example where you have a very rich set of effects, both with regard to externalities and with regard to the strategic structure, coming out of a very simple I/O problem. Okay. So what I want to do next, in the next half hour, is to work through one model in some detail, and then make some general observations about how one thinks about games on networks more generally. Okay, so maybe I should pause and ask before I get into a particular model and start solving it. Are there any comments or questions at this point? Yes. Sorry? Yeah, so eta jg is the number of neighbors that j has, and that's always going to be less than n. So this term within the bracket is positive, and so Sj is the effort of the neighbor. When that goes up, notice that this whole thing is within the square. Okay, so that's why it's good. Okay. Okay, any other? Okay, so this is the model on local public goods, and so I think the easiest way to see how this model works is to work through an example. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just set up one or two examples, and to get a feel of how this model works, and then we'll go through some of the more technical bits. Okay, so remember, the payoff function is pi I s conditional on g, and it is given by f of si plus summation sj, j being the neighbors of I, minus the cost of action of player I. Okay. There was an assumption buried somewhere in there, it's probably mentioned here. Prime of S. That's the level of effort which I would take on my own, which equates my marginal returns to the marginal costs. Okay. Okay, just keep this in mind, and a lot actually can, we can get a lot out of just keeping in mind this payoff function and this this assumption. Okay, so consider a simple network, okay, a ring network, and what's a very simple way to solve this game on this network? Well, a very simple way to solve this game, if I've written this down correctly, let's see if I've done it, so is to start with Mr. 1, okay, and say that Mr. 1 does S hat. Okay. If Mr. 1 does S hat, what about the neighbors of 2 and 7? Well, notice that if they have a neighbor who's doing S hat, their marginal returns from doing any work are lower than the marginal cost C, because F is concave. Okay. So a best response is for them to do, in fact, it is the only best response, is to do nothing, to do 0. Okay. If they both do 0, if you look at Mr. 3, well, Mr. 3, you can now assign him S hat. Okay? And similarly, you can assign S hat to 6. And now I can just work the same, I can work through the same way, and you can see that now I can assign 0 to 5, because she's getting S hat from a neighbor, and I can assign 0 to 4, because she's getting S hat from a neighbor. Okay, so what have I done? I've actually just written down a strategy profile. Okay, now I want to ask whether this is a Nash equilibrium. Does anyone have an incentive to deviate? Okay, let's look at the people who are doing the hard work. Mr. 1, can he do any better? He can't, because he's getting nothing from the neighbors. So his first best is what he would do on his own, which is S hat. And let's look at someone who's doing 0. Well, if you look at 4, Would she want to do any work? Not really, because the marginal cost is C and the marginal returns are lower than C because she's getting S hat from neighbor 3. Okay. So I haven't checked this, and you should check it just to be sure, but I think, I conjecture this is a Nash equilibrium. And what's really going on here is I have written down actually a specialized outcome where some people are working as hard as they would work if they were on an island, and others are doing no work at all. So this is a free riding and public good provision outcome. Okay. So what I've done here is I've exploited this assumption, okay, and I've exploited the concavity of F, which is really formally the strategic substitutes assumption. Okay. And so I could, of course, have started not with Mr. 1, but I could have started with Mr. 2 and done the same construction with Mr. 2. And so, in fact, you can see I could write down a number of Nash equilibria which would essentially be the same except for relabeling. Okay. Just to give you a sense of how this model works, let's look at another example, which is which is again very familiar, but it's a nice simple example to look at to get a little more intuition for how this model works. So what's going on here, this is a hub spoke network, and let me label these players 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and again now I can start with anyone, and let's start, who do you want to work hard? Number 1. Okay, so number 1 does S hat, and now what's the best response for all the others? It's 0, right? So that's one equilibrium, and you can check this is an equilibrium. If all my neighbors are doing 0, I have to do S hat, that's my first best. But once my neighbor is doing S hat, I have to, the unique best response is 0. Okay, so this is certainly one Nash equilibrium, but you could take the mirror image or the dual of this if you like, and you could start with 2 and get her to do S hat. Okay. What's going to happen then? 1 certainly won't do any work. Okay. And then you can see that you can get all the others to do S hat. Okay. So that's a Nash equilibrium. Again, this is an equilibrium with where you have specialization and free riding. Okay. And the way this model works again is you have a S hat where you're indifferent between this, where the marginal costs are related to your marginal returns, and if you go a little beyond, the marginal returns fall off because of the substitutes relationship. Okay. So that's the way this model works, and now we can build on that idea. Okay. So here's a concept that we are led to as soon as we start working with these examples. The way these examples work leads us to the idea of maximal independent set. So an independent set of a network G is a set of players who don't have any links between them. And a maximal independent set is a maximal such set. Okay. So what am I doing in this? I'm constructing these maximal independent sets. So I started with Mr. 1, and now I want to look at anyone else who doesn't have a link with 1. In fact, there's no one like that. So 1 is a singleton maximal independent set. Okay. But I could do, I could take the mirror image of that, and here's another maximal independent set, 2, 3, 4, 5. They don't have links among themselves, and they are the maximal such set. Because if you added 1, that condition would be violated. So what we have here is two, in a very simple network, you have 2 maximal independent sets, and that's really the key idea of how do you solve for equilibrium in this public goods game. You look for maximal independent sets, and all the maximal independent sets have this property that you assign S hat to every member of the maximal independent set, and you assign 0 to everyone outside the maximal independent set, and that's a Nash equilibrium. Okay. because if you're outside the maximal independent set, you are outside because you have a link with someone in the maximal independent set. And therefore, and since everyone in the maximal independent set is doing S hat, there's enough public goods being provided. Your marginal returns are lower than the marginal cost. Okay, and if you are in the maximal independent set, there is no one you're connected to who's doing any work at all. So it's as though you were isolated, and then you do S hat. Okay, so that's the construction. Okay, the rest of the slide just tells you that you can, for any network I give you, you can construct a maximal independent set. Yes? So I was not planning to talk about stability, okay? And this is one of the things you must ask Rachel. She's sitting there, and you can ask her in the break. I was not planning to talk about stability because I think it goes a little outside the. Do you want to say?
Well, the answer is yes, and in fact, there's other equilibria, but it's only the maximal independent sets which are the stable equilibria. So that's the answer.
Stable in.
Stable in terms of, well, so stability, which notion of stability? By the way, that's a huge headache when one's dealing with all of these different games, because you sort of have to construct a notion of stability that works for your game. So this is continuous action space, so on. We're using Nash, for the stability concept for which I can make that statement is Nash-Tatonement.
Say that louder.
Nash-Tatonement.
Oh, okay.
Right. So for that stability concept, we can solve for the set of stable equilibria from the set of Nash equilibria. So generally, there's game not in the star. By the way, not in the star, but say in a circle or in other networks, there are multiple equilibria, right? And some of those are not stable. Okay. So then we can talk about the set of stable equilibria set by invoking Nash, a particular, a formulation of Nash-Tatonement which works for this particular game.
Okay. Any other questions at this point? Okay, we've talked about some of this stuff already, so I'm going to go past, talked about this. Okay, so in fact, the observations I was making earlier imply that in any non-empty network, the maximal independent set will be a strict subset of the set of players, and therefore there will always exist an equilibrium, specialization equilibrium, where this maximal independent set does the work and the complement of the set free rides. Okay, so that's going to be a property of these. Okay. So it may not have been clear, but let me ask you, there is actually a very simple, there's another very simple equilibrium which you can imagine in this ring network. And that will be perfectly symmetric. Everybody does 1/3 of S hat. Right? If I get 1/3 of S hat, 1/3 of S hat, my best response is to do 1/3 of S hat. So you have a very different kind of an equilibrium where everyone's doing the same amount, and that's also an equilibrium. Okay, in these. So one might wonder, if you were to do it in an experimental setting, you might wonder what's going to happen. You might ask as a theorist, Larry might jump up and down and say, hey, which of these is stable? The fair distributed outcome or, those specialized equilibria, right? So it's a legitimate question. My sense is that we don't have a good answer from the experimental side. Maybe Rachel knows more about the experimental literature on this model, but it's quite. My sense is that we actually don't know which of these equilibria are played when people are asked to choose, so those are the kinds of things that one might want to pose to this model. So one of the things that one of the recurring themes. So if you read sociologists like C. Wright Mills, so you read almost any sociologist worth his name. In the 50s or even now, a major concern in major motivations for studying social structure is inequality, is the idea that if you have certain position in the network, you can exploit that position to create advantages. And social structure endows, reproduces inequality. That's a very old idea, and it resonates with us, with the Piketty book. Okay, so a notorious Piketty book. Okay,
A good break conversation.
yes, and so one might think and one might hope that there would be a very nice mapping between network structure, network location, and payoffs. Okay, that would be really great if one could say, if you are in this network and you are in this position in the network, you're going to be at a tremendous advantage. If you are in this network but somewhere else, you are going to be at a disadvantage. But we know already from this example, but also from this example, that it's not quite as straightforward to make those claims based on just Nash equilibrium and these networks. You can see, even though these networks are very stylized, in fact there are rather different, very different kinds of equilibria that might emerge. So in this hub-spoke network, you could have the highly connected person actually doing all the work and therefore earning the lowest payoffs, or the other way around, the most connected player free riding and earning the highest payoffs. And more generally, I think this is not a feature just of this model. I think more generally, network models have this feature that there are multiple equilibria, and they may have rather different properties, and therefore it's hard to have a clean relationship between structure and behavior and payoffs and welfare. Okay, so moving on to the idea of what is an optimal network, or what do networks do to welfare, here's a first observation. This comes almost straight out of the public goods problem, and I should add there's a very it's a very distinguished paper by Larry, an early paper by Larry actually, which speaks to some of these things, and maybe you want to come in at some point, before the end of this thing, how your early work on public goods, what it would have, what it would say. So I'm going to talk a little bit about policy in this setting, but maybe you would come in at that point and say a few words from your own work. So inefficiency here comes straight out of the public goods problem. When I increase my action, I compare that to the marginal cost C. I look at my marginal returns. I don't look at the returns of my neighbors, but they are also benefiting. I don't look at that. And in a non-empty network, it's going to lead to a wedge between private and social marginal returns. And so you will have under-provision. Okay, and that's the idea behind this proof. It just formalizes that intuition. At the Nash equilibrium, you will have under-provision. Okay, so in every Nash equilibrium, a non-empty network will be inefficient. Okay, so we are very interested in understanding, if you go from one network to another, if you change a network, what happens to behavior. So let's do that experiment in this simple example. There are two hub-spoke networks. You add a link between a hub and a spoke. This is the equilibrium being played. And you see that the equilibrium is it remains the original equilibrium, remains an equilibrium in the new network on the top. But if you were to add a link between the two hubs, it's no longer an equilibrium because the maximal independent sets have changed. And so now you see that you have a different equilibrium with very different payoffs and very different distribution. Okay. So what this example brings out is the effects of adding a link depends on the subtle details of where you add the link, okay, and which equilibrium was being played. So on the one hand, it's interesting because it says that you need to understand the details of the network and the context. On the other hand, it's a little, from a theorist's point of view, it's a little worrying because we may not actually know all the details of the network. We might like to say something general. If I throw in a link somewhere, welfare goes up because public goods are being shared more, so you should expect welfare to go up. But in fact, I've just constructed an example where welfare might strictly decrease after adding of a link. So there's a sense in which it's a two-edged sword. You could sort of see, depending on how you want to see it, it's not really quite clear the comparative statics, so to say. They don't work out as cleanly as one would like. So there's scope for refining equilibria, maybe working a little more on the structure of the payoffs to flesh out a bit more some of these things. Okay, so let me quickly summarize. So what I've shown you is that in this public goods problem, you naturally generate specialized equilibria which have free riding and payoff inequality. So networks naturally give rise to this sort of specialization and payoff inequality. It's hard to pin down a clean relationship between network structure and in the aggregate, also in terms of particular people, whether they do better or worse depending on their connectivity. And I should add, there is a very nice follow-up paper that's just been published in the American Economic Review, which looks at a more general framework and has a number of interesting results, which builds on this paper. And so I'll leave it at that, and I'll just pause now before moving to the complements example. Yeah. Are there any comments or questions?
Very clear.
Okay, so, yes.
Yeah, this is from earlier, but I was curious what the concept of stability is that we were talking about.
Yeah.
Structure of
Okay, so this is not something I think it's really quite outside, because stability is a big field. Many of us have worked in different aspects of stability, and unfortunately, this is not, I'm not sure that stability is, let me put it this way. So, and I'm very happy, for Larry and Rachel and maybe Shahar to come into this, but my sense is that in a model like this, I don't think stability, maybe there is some stability notion that gives you some results, but I don't think there's a clear sense that, you can refine away things and you get a crisp outcome. So that's the takeaway, and that's why I didn't want to get into different stability notions. But having said that, I see Rachel putting up a hand, and so I should let her speak. Yeah.
This is just to make a clarifying comment. So you maybe hear the notion or the word stability many times over the week. Okay, so just to think about when we say that word, what we mean. So in this context, we have a fixed network, okay, and individuals are playing an action given the network. The network is fixed, and we're looking at the individual actions, and we're looking for a Nash equilibrium. And so the notion of stability, when we say stable equilibrium here, we're saying which of these Nash equilibrium are stable, meaning if we perturb the agent's play by just a little bit, will you converge back to that equilibrium? The same thing you might, if you're TAing, your teaching assistant in an undergraduate class, and you have a Cournot equilibrium, and you have these best response curves that cross 3 times, and you say, okay, this is the stable equilibria, and these are 2 Nash equilibria, but they're not stable because you perturb the play by a little bit, you move away from that. So this, what we were talking about here, was the notion of whether or not the play, the action space is the play in a fixed network, is at a stable Nash equilibrium. You will also probably hear, I'm sure later in what Sanjeev is going to talk about, is whether if you have a game where the actions are forming the links, then we say, is the network itself
So I want to make 2 points. One of them is about stable, and Rachel, this is a chance for you and me to disagree. I actually don't think that stability is a terribly interesting question, and the reason why I don't is twofold. First, I think the actual question about perturbation and do you come back is not such an interesting question. I'll explain why in a second. And the other thing is that I think when we're asking questions about stability, we're really asking about a different concept. And I'll mention something about that. First thing first. Okay, so to say that I can invent a dynamic of some kind under which something is a putative rest point, right? Well, that's only interesting, a stable rest point. That's only interesting if the dynamic is itself, right, interesting. And talking about, for example, some kind of synchronous adjustment process in time where everybody updates according to best response. Does this correspond to something that's economically interesting? I think often not, okay? And maybe in some settings it is. There are many other kinds of dynamics that we could dream up. Now, this isn't really such a bad thing. I mean, I think this is the way that economics has actually has actually proceeded. That we begin by saying, let's look at markets, for instance, we really want to talk about the dynamics of markets, how market prices move, and so on and so forth. And then we say, well, gee, that's a really hard problem. We can't understand that. But notice that if we have these things called supply and demand curves that we can invent, and there is a notion of equilibrium that seems to make sense to us, and we might hope and pray, right, that if we could, that under many kinds of dynamic processes, what we see there would be more or less stable. Now, no one is actually, as you know, for example, competitive equilibrium is not necessarily stable under the thermodynamics. In fact, Herb Scarf invented an economy which has a single equilibrium, which is unstable. Okay, so gee, thermodynamics isn't very helpful. Other people have beat on this problem for some time, and no one has come up with any kind of satisfactory resolution to it. Has it stopped us from doing equilibrium analysis? Not at all. Okay. Similarly, in game theory, right? Think about evolutionary game theory for a moment, and think about evolutionarily stable strategies. This is a rest point in search of a dynamic. Okay, and those of you who studied evolutionary game theory know about the relationship, the kind of tortuous relationship to things like replicator dynamics and so on and so forth. So stability. So I think that stability doesn't turn out to be that important a question per se. But what is it that we're really interested in? What we're really interested in, I think, is robustness of the equilibrium, right? And with the idea that non-robust equilibria are not things that we should expect to see, right? Now, are there ways of addressing the question of robustness without actually thinking about stability per se? Well, one way of doing that is to ask the question, if we perturb the game a little bit, right, does the equilibrium go away, right? And so there is a large literature on this in game theory, and we know that lots of equilibria will disappear if you add a little bit of incomplete information. And this is particularly interesting because we don't really believe, right, the information assumptions that we make in a complete information game, right? No one can be really, I just can't know really how Sanjeev thinks, right? What his utility function is. I might have a good guess, right? I might choose to model that, some game in which he and I participate as a complete information game for all kinds of reasons, but I would be happier if I knew that my equilibrium, the equilibria that I were to look at, were stable under some kind of, which is to say that they persist, right? Under some kinds of incomplete information. And this, I think, is really the question that we want to get at. And I think that this is an important part of thinking about what equilibria I would want to look for empirically. And that's my first comment. And Rachel, do you want to argue with me?
No, actually, I completely agree.
Oh.
So you might have misunderstood what I was saying. I was just trying to help the audience understand when we said stability, we were talking about stability.
No,
equilibrium versus the network.
And that's
I'm
important.
completely with you. What we're looking for is robustness. How do we understand where we fit? If we're going to think about prediction, if we can ever get anything about prediction, how will we possibly do that? So I completely agree.
Okay. All right. And by the way, Rachel's point is that you will hear the word stable used in two very different ways within the course of Sanjeev's lectures, I think. Right? Because you will be talking about that tomorrow. All right. The second point the second point I wanted to make actually has to do with public goods per se. And notice that in this game, there's a very particular notion of how public goods are working, which is to say that your contribution and my contribution sum up, right, to the total amount of public goods that we have. Okay. There are many other ways, right, that we can model how public goods are created. There's a lovely paper by Jack Hirschleifer, and I can't recall the reference. I'm old enough to have read it, but too old to remember it.
Best shot games, and is that the one? Or? And the weakest link?
Yeah, that's the paper,
Yeah.
right? Do you know the title?
I think it's best short games versus weakest link games or something.
Something like that,
Yeah.
right? All I know is I have it in a book sitting at home, and if you send me an email when I get back to Ithaca, I can track it down for you. But exactly, so right there, best shot, weakest link. So imagine that we have, for example, we are all a computer network, right? And we want to be invulnerable as we can be to attack, right? Imagine that attackers are going to be hitting out all of us on the outside, right? The place where the attackers get in is the weakest link. So in some sense, the amount of public good that's provided is the minimum of all of the investments that we make. That's another public good technology. Best shot, Maximal, right? Hal Varian actually has talked about this explicitly in the concept of, in the framework of extending the public goods model after the paper that we wrote. And so these are other models to consider within the network framework. So don't look at this and say this is very pretty, this is done. Look at this and say this is very pretty, but this is only one idea. Okay.
So you see, I've invited these two people from remote parts of the world to give me a break so that I can get some more water. But now your time is over, Larry and Rachel, and I'm going to now talk for another 10 minutes till my water runs out. Okay, good. So I was not planning to do a lot on this because I thought I would actually not have time, but we have about 5 minutes. And so this is a game that's taken from the Ballister et al. Paper, and the point of this presentation was to, again, this is a very specific functional form, and I don't want to talk a great deal about that. The point is that you get complements. And when you get complements, there's a little bit more structure, but at the end of the day, the main takeaway from this slide is this proposition. And I'm going to come back to this in the next lecture, and this is the point I want you to take away, which is that behavior is nicely captured in this particular game by a notion of centrality, which is named after Philip Bonacek, Bonacek centrality, which is, so this is the equilibrium strategy, and what is it saying? It's saying it's proportional to the Bonacek centrality of the player. Okay, so to get a sense of,
He has about 3 notions of centrality.
yeah, so
Eigenvector, right? Is that the one you
this is the one eigenvector, yeah, but I was going to come to, yeah. Your time is over, Larry, yes. Okay, so the reason why I think it's interesting is there's another way to represent networks and to work with networks and to analyze network problems, and that is to write down games on networks in terms of adjacency matrices. Okay, so that's the idea that I wanted to bring through with this presentation. So you take any network G, you can represent that as an adjacency matrix, where you put in ones whenever there is a link and you put in zeros otherwise. In fact, you can make it much more general. When I have a link with Larry, and when I'm having a conversation with him, he talks all the time. So this is a link which flows one way, most of the time. It's a directed link, it's weighted, and whereas, if I'm talking to Shahar, I talk all the time and he listens. So this is a different kind of a weighted link. And so you could actually put all of that information in this adjacency matrix. So it's not a binary link, but it's actually a much richer object. And when you solve these games, essentially the way you solve them is that you can see that since the best response system is going to be a linear system, so you're going to have these S's, and when you write them out in matrix form, you're going to have to solve an inverse of a matrix. And essentially the Bonacek centrality is one amongst a class of eigenvector centralities, which all have this flavor that you're going to be looking at the inverse of a matrix. Okay, so the solution of the system, and that is something I would like you to keep in mind. That there's another way, a much richer way, if you like, to think about networks as weighted graphs, possibly weighted directed graphs, and you can solve those, okay, using familiar methods, and that's the takeaway from that model. And you can work through this. So I have a number of examples, and it's worked out in some, I would say, in gory detail. And there are a number of nice interpretations of monadic centrality, which I think worth bearing in mind. So I want to keep to time, so let me just go to the summary. So what I've tried to do in the first lecture is to give you a sense of how one introduces networks into what are otherwise standard public good games or games of complements, in terms of either a graph with a binary 1-0 link, or in terms of possibly weighted links and a general adjacency matrix. And then when you solve for these, I've given you a flavor of one way of solving it using maximal independent sets. It turns out actually it's a very rich and powerful way of thinking about strategic interaction in games. There are many other games, in fact, you can use maximal independent sets and the complement of the maximal independent set to solve those games. And the other concept I briefly talked about is monadic centrality, and I might come back to it in the next lecture, time permitting. And it's one amongst a family of eigenvector centrality notions that, for instance, if you're doing learning problems or you're doing diffusion problems, you think of eigenvector centralities. Okay, and so this is just one specific type of eigenvector centrality. Okay, and in fact, it relates to things like betweenness centrality and so on, which I'll also talk about in the next lecture. So let me just sum up in terms of looking forward. So we didn't really talk about incomplete network knowledge. So in this lecture, I assume that you know the full network. And in fact, you know everything, and you're solving for Nash equilibrium. And as Larry said, in fact, I think certainly in rich network context, it would be heroic to assume that you know the full network. The networks are very complex, they are evolving. It's more natural to think of a framework where you know something about the network locally, but you don't know a great deal about the network. It's a very complicated object. You may not care to know about the network, it's just too costly to figure out, or the network is changing and you can't keep track. So there's a lot of interest in understanding and studying incomplete network knowledge settings, behavior in incomplete knowledge settings. And that leads, of course, to the idea, when is it worth buying network knowledge? When is it interesting to actually invest in learning more about the network? Okay, so there is some work on that, and there are references in the lectures, but again, it's a very open field, very, very open question. In the models I've talked about so far, when I choose an action, it's an action that applies equally to all the links. But in many contexts, I have link-specific actions. If I work with one co-author, I might be shirking, but if I'm working with another co-author, I might be working very hard. So on different links, I may have different actions. In fact, many applications naturally suggest a framework which allows for link-specific actions. I talked briefly about this combination of strategic substitutes and complements. In fact, I would want to make the case that when you take networks to markets, it's games which have both substitutes and complements arise naturally. So we need to move forward from pure substitutes and pure complements games to games which have a combination of the two. And in the next lecture, I'll talk about one particular example of that. And the final point is about choice on links. So far I've assumed that the network is fixed, it's given. But a lot of the interest, and in fact I would say the major conceptual advance relative to Granovetter, and sociology is mostly in the space of network formation. The idea that individuals deliberately shape the social structure they inhabit. Now, this is going well beyond social determinism. In fact, it's going in the other way. It's saying that, it's individual determinism of social structure. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that, the last topic, in the lecture tomorrow, where I'll combine games on networks with games of network formation. Okay, so that's going to be the subject of the lecture tomorrow, and we are ready for a break now. I'll talk about 4.3 in the next lecture. Yeah. Any questions at this point? Comments?
Question.
Okay.
I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about the limitations of networks as ways of modeling social interaction. You kind of allude to some of them here, but can you want to say more? I think that's important.